U.S. History Summer School, we're back, and we gotta talk about the Articles of Confederation really quickly because this is our first form of government, and it was a disaster. To my point in an earlier video about how the 13 colonies were like totally separate and they only unified kind of during the Revolution just because they needed to, their idea was like, cool, we'll go back to being basically 13 separate states and we'll form a, quote, League of Friendship where the Continental Congress will just kind of oversee almost like an EU type situation. It was basically the ultimate experiment in states' rights, and it really didn't work, asked George Washington. As commander-in-chief of the military, he had his army basically disbanded on multiple winters because the Congress couldn't raise troops. They couldn't force the different militias and states to send food. So like his soldiers were starving. When the war was over, each state had their own debts to deal with. There was a rebellion in Massachusetts called Shea's Rebellion. The Congress couldn't levy taxes. Nothing. It was a disaster. So some of the delegates start meeting up to revise, and then they're like, we should just scrap this and start over. Hey, this is gonna be a really niche US history rant, but I would just like to take a minute to argue in defense of the Articles of Confederation. Just as a quick review, this is our original government, the first US government that was established in 1777, 1 year after we declared independence, and it's the one that gets us through the whole Revolutionary War. Then, it struggles, it's fairly weak, and so then they have a convention, they're like, should we edit this Google Doc? Let's throw it out, and they make the Constitution. And the way that the Articles of Confederation is normally talked about and understood is just well, those sucked. They're weak, they failed. And I just don't like that. It's sort of the way I feel about World War I. Everyone skips over World War I to talk about World War II, and I'm like, I'm sorry. World War I is fascinating and so important. And again, just to be clear, I do think the Constitution was a better format for a democratic government. I really do. I think it was an improvement. I'm just saying this whole narrative of the Articles just being the dummies that then are improved by the Constitution is that's not fair. Argument number one. They won the Revolutionary War under the Articles of Confederation. The government under the Articles of Confederation is the one that negotiated the alliance with France, hey Lafayette, and the one that negotiated the Treaty of Paris, which was hella good for the United States, all things considered. Number two, the Articles of Confederation, that government really successfully helped establish a pattern for settlement/colonization of the new territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, I'm going to be talking about this from the white American colonizer point of view, but from their point of view, it was very successful. Basically, each of the 13 colonies, now states, just wanted to extend west and have these really long, skinny states. They wanted to claim all that land for their own state. And the government under the Articles was no, we need to reserve that for new settlements, new territories, eventually new states. And they banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, and there wasn't a civil war. That's pretty successful. I mean, the bar in US history is just was there a civil war? If not, good job, America. And lastly, I want to give some credit to the government under the Articles of Confederation that really, that's a revolutionary document, those articles. I mean, man, did we go way far on the other side, right? We're not even an absolute monarchy. We want to go to basically an earlier equivalent of the EU, right? We're all just these separate states that come together kind of for common defense, but otherwise they're completely independent. They were able to get 13 completely separate colonies, different colonial governments, different colonial social structures, economics, whatever, morals, everything, to all come together into a confederation. And yes, it was weak. And yes, the kind of Congress couldn't really do a lot. So we end up changing it for the Constitution. But I'm just saying, our first draft government wasn't as bad as a lot of people like to make it seem. It served its purpose. Let's just thank it and then move on. Okay, so a bunch of young, rich, white, mostly college-educated, land-owning dudes showed up in Philadelphia for what would become the Constitutional Convention. The issue at hand was how strong the federal government should be, and frankly, that's just been the issue at hand in the United States ever since. The proposal led by people like Hamilton and Madison was federalism, basically a really strong central government, but that was limited in its power. Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote like he was running out of time, and the Federalist Papers were published by Hamilton, Madison, and Shea. They were convincing people of why we needed a stronger central government and why it wouldn't be another absolute monarchy. Anti-Federalists, the people who really just wanted to edit the Articles of Confederation, were really nervous, and so the biggest compromise was that, hey, if you ratify this new constitution that's more federalist, we will give you a Bill of Rights with the first 10 minutes protecting individual and states' rights from a powerful central government. The Great Compromise bridged the divide between big and small states, with representation in the House being based on population and just 2 senators for every state in the Senate. And of course the Electoral College, because the Founding Fathers were terrified of actual democracy. The biggest contradiction during this whole revolutionary articles and constitutional era is going to be the status of enslaved people in the new United States. Because obviously, like, Thomas Jefferson wrote the words, "all men are created equal," while among many other things, having an enslaved servant who was also the older brother of Sally Hemings, the enslaved woman who Jefferson was fathering children with. James Hemings was also the half-brother of Thomas Jefferson's wife, because they both had the same white slave-owning father. It's interesting because during the Revolutionary and the Articles of Confederation period, the Continental Congress did take some steps to slowly move towards ending slavery. So they abolished the international slave trade and the importation of enslaved people. A lot of states just outright abolished slavery. A lot of the founding fathers, even the ones who did own slaves like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, were on record saying that they understood that slavery shouldn't and couldn't continue to exist in this new nation, that it was a contradiction. They knew that, but, and this is frustrating for us in the modern view to look back on, they couldn't figure out how to end it. We're like, we'll just end it. But they were afraid, right? They didn't really understand what a nation could look like that had both white and black people free in the same place. And so they just kind of kept putting it off, and they really genuinely just thought that slavery would just slowly phase itself out, especially with growing industrialization in England. They're like, there are going to be way more cost-effective ways to produce things very soon. We see this in the Constitution, right, with the 3/5 compromise, which is one of the most horrendous things American politicians have ever done, right? Because there was the issue of representation in Congress, and slave-owning states were like, well, our enslaved people should count towards our population. The non-slave-owning representatives were like, well, no, because you're not treating them as human beings, and so why would we count them as human beings? And so they come up with this 3/5 compromise where they just so inhumanely say that enslaved Africans are worth 3/5 of a white person. The point is that the founders were making all of these compromises just on the understanding that they're like, oh, we're too tenuous right now. We don't want to break this new state open with the issue of slavery. And they were just sort of hopeful that it would end on its own over the course of the next few decades. The problem is that just after the Constitution is ratified in 1793, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. What this does is it makes processing cotton just so much faster and easier. So basically now, cotton plantation owners can process and sell as much cotton as they can pick and feed into this machine. And so ironically, industrialization, which is the thing they thought would make slavery sort of obsolete, actually now slave owners are incentivized to get even more enslaved people and plant and pick as much cotton as possible to then feed those machines to send over to England to create textiles in their new industrial textile factories. So slavery actually grows after the constitutional period. And of course, we're going to come back and talk about this issue way more.